Hey guys, this is Aiden with Odin Coding, and today we're going to be going over how to build a simple to-do app with vanilla JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. So let's get started. First thing I want to do is create an index.html file with this command called touch, which will create a file for us. We can also use the UI if we want to. And in that file, we're going to create a template for our HTML, which we're going to use the IntelliSense and type an exclamation mark and just hit enter. And you'll see we're generated a very basic HTML template and we can work with this. So just to very briefly go over here, you see we have the doc type tag, the HTML tag, which everything is enclosed in. The head tag contains two meta tags that specify the character set and the viewport, which is going to be equal to the device width, and the title of the HTML document, and the body tag. So basically we want to change the title because the title is what's going to be reflected in the tab on our browser. So now it will reflect my to-do list, which is exactly what we want. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a script tag, and that's going to be in the head tag, and that's going to link our JavaScript file, which we haven't created yet. You could also write JavaScript directly in the script tag, but here you see we'll use the source attribute, and we'll set it equal to a JavaScript file. You can tell by the .js extension. And we're going to include the async keyword here as well. So I want to take a second to talk about the async keyword, and basically the purpose of the async keyword is to load the JavaScript asynchronously. So you can imagine when a browser is loading this index.html file, instead of waiting for all the JavaScript to be loaded before the rest of the page loads, it's going to continue loading your HTML and load the JavaScript sort of in the background. So this won't really make a huge difference for us because we're working with such a small file, but it is good practice and you should definitely use the async word if you're going to build a single page app like this. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to fill out the actual HTML body here. You can see we're going to have an h1 tag for the header. We're going to label this input. That'll be where we can add a new to-do item. And we're going to have a button here that's going to allow us to submit that new to-do item. I'm trying to use all the class names very specific here. It's definitely good practice whenever you're writing an HTML or a template to have your classes describe pretty much exactly what the corresponding elements do. And we can also use these classes to access these in CSS later. And inside this div, which is going to be our to-do container, you'll notice I'm only going to put an unordered list element. I'm not actually going to add any list items inside of it because we're going to add those through JavaScript. That's how we're going to manipulate the DOM, is we're going to add a list item for every to-do item. And that is basically all the HTML elements we're going to need to add on this HTML file. I'm just going to clean up here, make it look a little neater. Indenting is definitely a good way to do that. But basically the rest of our application is going to be JavaScript and CSS. So let's move on and create our index.js file like we reference on line 7. We can use the command line interface here, or we can just add it through the UI, through the add file up here, exactly the same thing. And what our JavaScript is going to do is that's going to be all our logic. So as far as adding new to-do items, rendering new elements that don't currently exist in HTML, eventually deleting to-do items, and anything like that, that's what our JavaScript file is going to host. So here we have an array of things to do, and in JavaScript we can declare variables with the let keyword. There's actually more than one keyword we can declare variables with, but today we're going to be working with let, and you can see we assign it to an array of strings. Here in our unordered list tag, we're actually going to add a new list item for everything to do we have in this list. The first thing we want to do is actually grab that list, kind of access it on the JavaScript side. So we use this thing called query selector, and we use document.querySelector because we're selecting it from the document, and we're going to reference its class, which is to-do list. A class will be referenced with a period beforehand. If we were to reference an ID, you'd use a hashtag. There's a lot of different ways to reference things. But this is basically going to grab the first instance of a class named to-do-list. And we're going to assign that to a variable called list. I want to take a second to talk about the document keyword here, because the whole point of this video is to demonstrate how to manipulate the DOM, or document object model. So we can think of the document object model as sort of a series of nodes that kind of describe what the layout of our web page is going to be like. And the document keyword, the most easiest way to think about that is to consider it referencing exactly the index.html document. So whenever we say document dot, we're performing something in reference to the HTML document. So we're going to go ahead and use that document query selector again to select the submit button that we defined in our HTML. And we're going to do something called adding an event listener. So an event listener is exactly what it sounds like. It's going to listen for a specific event that we define, and that event will occur on an HTML element. I'm just going to clean up the code a little bit here. So as you can imagine, a button can be clicked, so we're going to listen for that click event and call a function inside. In this case, that function is just going to console log the string woof. So we can actually go to the browser and see what that looks like in practice. And to do that, we're just going to run this command in the command line called open index.html. That does exactly what it says. It's going to open our HTML file in whatever our default browser is. In my case, I believe it's Google Chrome. So let's go ahead and run that command and let's see what our browser gives us. We have the beginning of our to-do app, and we're going to go ahead and mess with this button. But if we right click here and go to inspect, we bring up something called the developer tools, and these are super important. You'll see we have the elements here. This literally shows you all the HTML elements displayed on the page. We can kind of scroll through them. And the console, you'll notice that just like we wrote that console log statement in our JavaScript, we were able to console log the word woof when we press our submit button. So everything's working as it should be. Going back to our code, we see we have our array of things to do, and you see this unordered list. We want to map over all these things to do and render a new list item inside that unordered list. So we're going to use the JavaScript built-in function map, and for every to-do, and the to-do will be an individual string, we're going to create a new element. We'll just call it new to-do, and we can use the create element on document and add an li, which is a list item. And we're actually going to go ahead and assign the inner text of that new to-do, the to-do string corresponding in the things to do array. So basically the inner text is just what it sounds like. It's going to be the text within the li element. And finally, we're going to go ahead and reference that list we created earlier, and we're going to append or add the new to-do item to that list. And this will allow it to be rendered on the DOM whenever the JavaScript loads. Now let's turn our attention to the event listener. Right now all this does is log a message woof, which is not what we wanted to do. We wanted to add a new to-do item. So we're going to go ahead and copy this logic because we're going to do just about the same thing as we did in things-to-do.map. We're going to create a new to-do item and add it to the list. Except now we're going to have to do something where we create a local variable that references the input value of the input tag. So we'll do the same thing with query selector, and we called it new to do input. The only thing we're going to do different here is that we're going to do dot value. So basically this is going to grab the value of the input tag at the time that the event occurs. So when the button is clicked. So whatever is in that bar when the button is clicked, that's what text input will be. We're going to add inner text to new to do, and that's going to be equal to our text input. And just as we did above, we're going to append our list with the new to-do item. So you can see we're starting to see a lot of repeating logic here for these two functions. Basically, they just create a new element, adjust the text, and add it to the UI. So let's go ahead and navigate to the browser and see how this works. And you can see we type in a new to-do item and we hit add, and it is added to our list. Just keep in mind this will be erased whenever we refresh our browser, because when we refresh our browser, the JavaScript is reloaded and we only have our hard-coded to-do list. So next up, we want to go ahead and add some delete functionality so we can delete to-do items when we've completed them. And we're going to follow our same model here. We're going to create a local variable, and we're going to equate it to one of our HTML elements. This will be our button element. And this button is going to allow us to delete things. So we're going to set the inner text to just the string X. You can set it to delete or whatever you want really, but I just think X is going to look best for our user interface. And then what we want to do with our delete button is we want to kind of follow the same approach here, where we append our delete button to our list item. So basically, to keep them on the same line, we want our button to exist within the list item. So if we were to look at it in HTML, it would be list item and then button inside of it. And then we will append entirely the new to-do to the list. And now we're going to add the functionality to actually delete our to-do item. So we'll use the add event listener on the same element here, the delete button. We're going to add the same event, which is the click event. And we're going to use a default JavaScript method called .remove. And remove does exactly what it sounds like. It removes the actual element from the entire DOM tree. So it's no longer going to exist. It'll be out of our list. And for our purposes, this should work perfectly. So let's take a look at this in the browser. And we can click on that X and see that the element is deleted, which is perfect. And if we go to our developer tools over here and look at the elements tab, we can actually view our unordered list and the two LIs within it. And if we delete one of these LIs, you'll see that it actually disappears from that list. So this is a live update and totally accurate. And I want to talk really briefly about a concept called dry, or don't repeat yourself, which is very related to encapsulation in object-oriented programming. Basically, the idea is that we don't want to write repeated code over and over again if we don't have to. So you can see we're doing a lot of the same things in these two functions, creating the same elements, adding the delete button functionality. So at any time when you're writing code, if you can encapsulate these things into a different function and just call that function in multiple places, it'll be simpler, quicker, easier to write, and a lot easier for people reading your code to understand it, which is very important. So if we notice about the new to do, delete button, new to do.remove, a lot of these functionalities are repeated. So we're going to go ahead and just create a single function to call them all. We'll call it update list, and we're going to have to pass it a new to do item as an argument. Inside this function, we're going to have pretty much 4 pieces of logic. The first will be to create our elements, which is going to be the new to do and the delete item. Then we're going to assign text to those elements, which will either be X or whatever the to-do item is. We're going to add the ability to delete them, and we're also going to add these to the DOM itself. So once we create them, we'll have to add them. We're going to follow pretty much the exact same logic here. We're going to create new to-do variable, create a list item element, and we'll also create our delete button. And like I said before, these are just creating elements here in JavaScript, and we're going to add them to the HTML when we append. To assign the text, we're going to assign the to-do item whatever text is passed. So when we call this function, we're going to pass it either the value from the input or the value from the things to do array. The delete button will still just be the X or whatever you choose to write, delete or backspace or whatever you feel like. The delete logic will also be the same. We can go ahead and just copy this function. It's going to remove whatever the to-do is. So when it says new to-do there, it's referencing the created variable on line 30, new to-do. And the append logic will actually be exactly the same as well. We're going to add the delete button to the list item and then add the list item to the list itself on the DOM. So now what we can do to save ourselves a lot of trouble is we can go up to things-to-do.map, and instead of all that logic, we could just reference our function. So we can just call update list, and we're going to pass it each to-do item that we map over. And we're going to actually go ahead and do the exact same thing in the event listener for creating a new to-do item. The only difference is to get that text, we're going to have to continue to reference the text input, which is the query selector.value. But we'll pass that text input into our update list function. And with that, our application is complete. We can go to the browser and check it out. And if we type in a new to-do item, we are able to add it to our list. And if we click on our delete button, it deletes it from our list. The next step is going to be adding CSS to style this, but that is going to be another video. I want to point out that I have a corresponding Medium blog that kind of goes over all this stuff a little more in depth. And the main point of this video was to give everyone a head start on how to manipulate the DOM with JavaScript. So you may know how to write HTML and write elements, but the whole thing about web design is being able to control those elements and manipulate them with code. So this is very, very basic vanilla JavaScript, but it's really important to understand these key concepts when you're beginning programming. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below and I'll get back to you. Thanks.